Along with several other channels, I was invited to participate in round 2 of the Dark Souls one-shot contest hosted by Lemon at the Backlogs. So while this is my first time participating in such a contest, and I didn't have to know the suffering of the first one, rest assured that there is still plenty of pain and suffering to go around. However, unlike the first challenge, there is one big quality of life change made to the rules, which is that using Cheat Engine to dupe items is perfectly legal. But items can only be spawned in if we've reached the point where it's possible to farm them infinitely, so this rule was introduced to save time and storage space in places where we'd otherwise spend several hours farming for materials. Since the Covenant of Champions is available at the very start of the game, we were all allowed to cheat in souls to max out our stats, but I decided to hold off on doing that until I had beaten just one boss on my own without environmental damage. I don't know why I established this arbitrary boundary, I just did. Speaking of environmental damage, this is also acceptable in the run and counts as a 0 shot, which nets us 2 points. As for everything else, any button press that does damage to a target counts as a hit. If we kill a target with only one button press, it counts as a 1 shot and grants 2 points. So even if we use a spell or melee attack that hits multiple times, as long as we only pressed a button once, it still counts as a 1 shot. On the other hand, using something like Lingering Flame to set off several mines would not be legal, since this method requires 3 or more button presses. Lastly, in the later stages of testing the challenge, it was decided by everyone that this would be a 1 or 2 shot contest, since at a certain point, it becomes impossible to progress without at least 2-shotting a boss. So killing a boss in 2 hits is legal. However, if you do this, you only get 1 point, so it's still worth it to try as hard as you can to perform a 1-shot, until you are absolutely sure that it's not feasible. Oh, and obviously glitches aren't legal either, so no tumble buffing allowed. There are a few smaller parts of the general rule set, but since I take a decade to explain the rules of my own challenges, I'll leave it up to Lemon to explain all that in his video. Now then, for the moment you've all been waiting for, let's start the challenge. I decided to make my character Anton Chigurh, or at least that was what he was supposed to look like, but you get the idea. Just pretend that whatever we use to one-shot a target is a bolt stunner. Naturally, the first target I set my sights on is the Dragon Rider. As always, I let him fall to his death using the built-in environmental hazards in the arena, which counts as a 0 shot. Using the souls we got from our trip to the Tower of Flame will be enough to buy the Silver Cat Ring, which I'm gonna need to get something very important for the challenge. And, since the path is open, I also head down to No Man's Wharf for my first copy of the Greatsword. After getting enough levels to two-hand it, I make my way down the pit, which is where the Silver Cat Ring will come in handy. Down here is where we will find Whisper of Despair, which is a debuff that slightly decreases the physical defense of an enemy, and since it doesn't do any damage, I'm allowed to use it to assist me with my 1- and 2-shotting. On the other side of the map, I also pick up the Red Tearstone Ring, and we all know what that one does, but it is worth noting that in Scholar of the First Sin, it only affects melee damage and will not increase spell damage. With most of our initial setup out of the way, we might as well start making our way towards one of the easiest bosses to one-shot in the game. One notable thing about this area is that this giant basilisk here has a guaranteed large Titanite shard drop, and it respawns, so since it can be farmed indefinitely, we have now unlocked the ability to cheat in large Titanite shards. Alternatively, I can continue down to the Black Gulch to get both large Titanite shards and Titanite chunks infinitely from the Koltars. So this means we can get our Greatsword to +9 already. And as luck would have it, as I was trading some stones with the birds, I managed to get a Titanite slab. Well, I think it's safe to say that I should do more than enough damage to one-shot the Skeleton Lords on the first try. Of course a nearly maxed out Greatsword with RTSR isn't enough to one-shot a Skeleton Lord. Why would I have thought otherwise? The best method to one-shot them would be backstabbing, since I don't even need RTSR for that. but sometimes the uneven terrain can interfere with that. The biggest problem I had in this fight wasn't even the skeleton lords themselves. It was those damn blocking skeletons getting caught in the crossfire and ruining an entire attempt. Okay, I'll admit, sometimes I just died from my own stupidity, but most of the time something went wrong that was out of my control. For instance, the skeletons can get hurt by the fireballs, which counts as environmental damage, which also ruins my one-shot. Somehow by now I hadn't maxed out my greatsword yet, so hopefully that helps to some degree. You know, if I had just used a strike weapon like the Great Club, I probably wouldn't have had to worry about any of the aforementioned woes at all in this fight. According to the wiki, the skeleton lords are extremely weak to strike damage. And the funny thing is, I checked resistances and absorptions religiously throughout this run, but since I wrote this one off as just the skeleton lords, I didn't bother to check it before fighting them. But hindsight is always 20/20. I got it done regardless, so there's nothing I can do about it now. After very meticulously reviewing the footage and rewatching every single action I made in this fight, I can say with confidence that I killed every individual target in one hit, and thus have one-shot yet another target on the list. Now I can finally cheat in all those levels. I'll get to that in a moment. For now, I have one more item I need to grind out from the big guys at the Harvest Valley. These enemies can drop smooth and silky stones, which can be traded with the birds to receive every type of upgrade material, as well as a few more weapons we'll need for one-shotting. I don't know the exact drop rate on them, but I didn't remember it being a particularly rare drop, but somehow it took me 40 minutes to get a single stone to drop. I'm willing to believe that I just had really bad luck, but what also could have happened is that they were falling through the floor the whole time, which is a weird DS2 engine quirk that is most obvious in the gutter, but occasionally happens in other areas with weird floors. The reason I ultimately came to that conclusion is because when I tried to farm it from a different enemy, it barely took any time at all to get one to drop. But now that I've proven I have an infinite farm, I can now spawn in as many of these as I want to play my favorite bird gacha game. It didn't take too long to get the drops I was looking for, those being the Demon's Great Hammer and the Channeler's Trident. Of course, I also got some Twinkling Titanite and Petrified Dragon Bones, but from this point forward, I'm gonna skip the middleman and just spawn those in directly, because no one needs to watch me drop and pick up items for an hour. Now, for those levels I mentioned earlier, I'm gonna start by maxing out Strength, Intelligence, and Faith, because I need every last drop of damage I can get on elemental buffs, and the one I'll be using the most is Resonant Weapon, aka Dark Damage, which scales off of Int and Faith. With my fully upgraded Demon Hammer, it's time to use my soul memory to bypass the Shrine of Winter, and thus gain access to the city of Aleamlois. I'm not going to be doing any one-shotting here, obviously. I just need to make a quick stop for the Dark Clutch Ring. After purchasing Resonant Weapon, as well as a few pieces of Dark Pine Resin from Falcon, our setup for the last giant is ready. I also have some Bright Bugs from Malentia, which I'll need to use carefully since I only have a few this early on. My usual buff routine is to use a Bright Bug first, then apply weapon buffs, then do the Trident buff, but for this fight, I need to have enough time to hit him before the Trident buff wears off, so the only thing I do outside of the Fog Gate is the Bright Bug. We'll have to find openings for the rest during the fight itself. After hitting him right in the shitter with Whisper of Despair, I need to space him out so I can cast Resonant Weapon on my greatsword. I practiced this whole routine a lot during the testing period of the challenge, but whether or not he catches up to you while you're dancing is pretty dependent on luck. As for the method I used to one-shot him, I figured this out during testing as well. At first, I was power stancing 2 Demon's Great Hammers, but no matter what, the damage was never quite enough. Through a process of elimination, as well as some helpful motion value info shared by other challenge runners, I figured it would be better to power stance a Great Hammer in the right hand with an Ultra Greatsword in the left. The extra damage also may have just been the counter damage given by the Greatsword. Either way, both of those factors were enough to defeat the last giant in one hit. Even though I've already done the Skeleton Lords, this felt like the first proper one-shot of the playthrough. With one big target crossed off the list, we have some room to slow down for a bit, and focus on a few of the smaller targets. A lot of the early NPCs have very small health pools, and should be very easy to one-shot, and anyone who has no use to me is getting cold right away. Even Pate can be taken out, since Creighton's questline will proceed as normal as long as we don't kill him without finishing his half of the quest. Nobody up to this point gives me any problems except for Falcon. He's partially protected by the low ceiling he's sitting under, so one of my weapons will always bounce off. Usually this isn't the case for NPCs, but if he somehow is resistant to dark damage, being a hexer and all, I prepare for that by going to get some gold pine resin from my good pal Vingarl. He also sells infinite great swords, which will be especially useful when we unlock infusions. I also picked up Great Magic Weapon in the Gutter, which I only use in cases where something is highly resistant to dark damage. Since I was too lazy to try to realign myself to not hit the ceiling, I decided to aggro him and reset his health at the bonfire. Hey, why can't my Sunset Staff cast Pyromancy? Alright, now I feel refreshed and ready to take on another boss. The obvious choice here is the Royal Rat Vanguard. Hopefully I can do this without the full buff routine. It's not like the rats will give me time for a trident dance anyway. Every time I do this fight, I end up dying. I need to make a mental note to myself to use Alluring Skulls. I think the only thing I ever use them for in any of the games is the first boar in Undead Burg. While this fight definitely took up way more time than it needed to, as always, it was mostly just a patience issue. As long as I didn't try to bite off more than I could chew and take out a whole group, trading hits wouldn't be an issue. I also didn't need to be in RTSR range until the actual boss rat showed up, so that made it a little easier. And once it did show up, all I had to do was dodge rats until all my buffs were done, then go in for the kill. It wouldn't have made a difference anyway, but since the other rats are not part of the health bar, they do not have to be one-shotted. Only targets that are part of a boss's health will be counted, which was the case for the Skeleton Lords, but not the case for the rats. Well, I guess I might as well kill you too while I'm down here. I am gonna cheat in some levels into Vitality so I don't have to feel so slow, but I do want to stop it at a certain point so I can still respec later and try Flimsering if I make it that far. You know what? This guy's a weakling too, and what do we even need him for after all? Before I try any other bosses, I need to max out Dexterity as well. Can't forget about that Dex scaling. And the only logical thing to do after that would be to get another copy of my pure strength scaling Great Hammer. I had already done enough testing to know that this setup is not enough to beat the Pursuer. Since the Pursuer is strong against Dark, I had to use Great Magic Weapon for this one. The guy knows I have no chance, so couldn't he at least let me get one hit in for the demonstration? Just to be nice? I'm taking this out on you, Gavlin. Unless I'm missing something really important, the Pursuer is not happening with my current setup. Since I knew for a fact that I could only beat Najka in 2 hits, I decided to shift my focus away from the Pursuer and towards her, because if I can beat her, then I can get the engraved gauntlets, and with those, I would be able to beat the Pursuer no matter what. She is very weak to thrust damage, which works out really well since thrusting weapons naturally have high counter damage, and Najka has very generous counter damage windows. It also isn't hard to buff in this fight. After hitting her with Whisper of Despair, you can move behind a branch to continue the rest of the routine safely, as long as she doesn't use Soul Geyser. This fight had me stumped for a really long time. I felt like I had hit a wall where I couldn't possibly increase my damage any further. That is, without getting the old Leo ring or defeating the Pursuer. I was hoping to get a few Black Knight weapons to try, due to their innate fire damage, but little did I know that these particular enemies don't respawn even in the Covenant of Champions. I did manage to get the Great Axe, but it didn't perform as well as I'd hoped. I thought I had made a breakthrough when I remembered that you can farm charcoal pine resin, but after everything, even though she is most weak to fire damage, Resonant Weapon with the Grand Lance's heavy attack still outperformed everything. If I had been able to access the Fire Clutch ring, the damage might have been enough, but there's no point in even thinking about that since it's guarded by Ava. I ended up speaking to another challenge runner about this, and after hearing that they had in fact used the Leo ring, it was time for me to face the facts and just accept a 2-shot victory on the old Dragon Slayer. The old Dragon Slayer doesn't have much health, but since he is strong against Dark, I couldn't use my strongest tools against him, so even though a one-shot is absolutely possible, with what I can access now, I would have to sacrifice a point on either this guy or on the Pursuer, and I have way too much beef with the Pursuer to even consider letting him off easy. I didn't use all my buffs this time since I was just going for a 2-shot anyway, but I did try one-shotting him several times and it was always really close. I may have been able to do it if I had tried it a bit longer, but I really wanted to get Najka out of the way, so I prioritized saving time over everything else. I was so eager about finally being able to get the kill that I forgot to actually equip the ring for the first hit. No matter, the damage without it was already so close that having it on for the second hit alone will be more than enough. Najka might as well be the only thing standing between me and those gauntlets. I'm pretty sure most people casually one-shot Magus in a regular playthrough. Just to change up the usual pattern, I started this fight with the Ice Rapier. I thought it might be fun to use the crits on Magus and the priests, and the projectile attack for the rest of the congregation. Well, that's what I get for trying to be different, I guess. Forget being different. Tried and true is the way to go, baby. I just want those gauntlets. I don't care if Magus is resistant to Dark. My hammer says otherwise. Oh, and between you and me, what you're watching now is actually a retake. I somehow transferred the wrong clip of the Magus fight to my folder and deleted the footage where I one-shotted him, so I had to respawn the boss with Cheat Engine and use it to change my stats to match where they were during this part of the run. But you know what? I'm glad that of all the things that could have gone wrong, it was just the Magus fight. If this had happened on one of the fights that took me 5 hours, I would have lost it and deleted the entire challenge folder from my hard drive. You have no idea how long I've waited to hear that beautiful sound. I feel like a huge burden has been lifted off my soul. It sure feels good to be able to one-shot something without worrying about a 15-second time window for the Trident buff. Of course, now that I have the Ring of Blades, I get a little extra physical damage, and trust me when I say that every extra digit I can add to my physical AR counts. Since the Ruined Sentinels are weak to strike damage, a couple of dark-buffed Great Hammers will do the trick. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but even bosses with multiple health bars only count for either 1 or 2 points, since it is still a single boss encounter, so one-shotting all 3 of them is still going to count for 2 points overall. The Ruined Sentinels may have been easy marks, but the Bellkeeper was much more stubborn. No matter what, this guy just did not want to die, and it didn't help that Whisper of Despair seemingly went right through him, so I ended up having to aggro this guy too. He's tougher than you'd expect a puppet to be. Not only that, but he's so fast that I barely get a chance to buff up after debuffing him. No matter how much he tries to challenge his fate, in the end, he made the wrong call, and I'm just here to make sure he honors his part of the bet. Before I move on to the gargoyles, I'd like to clean up a few more of the smaller targets, mostly just useless NPCs again. The only one out of this bunch that could potentially be of any use is the Pardoner, since the Lost Sinner's sword has a damage penalty for sinners, but we can always speak with him from the great beyond, so there's no reason to show him any mercy. Now then, let's move on to another boss. It's time for the Gargoyles, another multi-target fight, hooray! Okay, so instead of blindly rushing in, you really should wait for them to finish an attack first since they have a long recovery time on their swings. I also learned that ignoring the closest gargoyle and going for the one by the exit is actually way easier. Once you get the first two down, you should be able to finish off the rest one by one, because there shouldn't be any time for them to assemble the gank squad. I was pleasantly surprised by the simplicity of this fight, and though I initially thought it would be a milestone in the playthrough due to the bright bug farm it unlocks, I ended up not needing a bright bug farm, and I'll admit, I was a little deterred from trying it since these guys would have to be respawned each time. After this, I went ahead and got vitality to 99. This should be fine for now, because as long as I have at least one stat that stays unleveled, I'll still be able to reallocate my stats as needed for Flynn's Ring. Judging from the available targets at this point, Covetous Demon seemed the most possible with his extreme weakness to thrust. He has even less health than Najka, and we just saw the power of a good counter hit with Leo Ring. So based on that, there should be no reason that we can't one-shot this guy, since we have even more help than before, especially with those beautiful engraved gauntlets. I gotta say, I was really surprised that a single charged attack with the lance wasn't enough to get the job done, because not only is he weak to thrust damage, but his overall physical defense is also quite a bit lower than Najka's. This is the part of the run where I learned the sad reality about the gauntlets, and one of their biggest shortcomings, multi-hit attacks. We'll talk a little more about this in a second. For now, I need to rest my brain a little and focus on something else. For some reason, I was a little scared to try the Lost Sinner since she doesn't have any glaring weaknesses, at least on the physical side, so I wasn't sure if I'd be able to one-shot her or not, despite her having a lot less HP than the Covetous Demon. I decided to try her regardless because, if nothing else, surely the gauntlets would be enough to push our damage over the edge. Since her defenses for every type of physical damage are the same, I went with the Power Stance Greatswords for this one to take advantage of their counter damage. With how jumpy she is, I knew from the start that I wouldn't be able to debuff her with Whisper of Despair, but based on the damage on my first attempt, I started to think that maybe I would have to find a way to work it in. Before I worry about that, I have to rule out the gauntlet crit first, so even though I wasn't too sure about this fight, something told me to give it another go. You should always trust your instincts. At the time, I was really surprised at this one-shot, because I could have sworn that I didn't even hear the gauntlets. Turns out, I didn't. Apparently, she has a hitbox on her head. So this is one of the few instances where a boss's weakness actually is their head. Contrary to what the wiki says, this run proved that the last giant does not have a weak spot on his head. I baited the attack where he falls over and it did the exact same amount of damage as hitting him anywhere else. That's enough sidetracking for now. I need to focus on my biggest problem at the moment, which is the Covetous Demon. As I was saying earlier, multi-hit attacks are a big problem for the gauntlets, because while it's still a single button press, every hit in the attack will be rolled individually for the crit. So if you were using something that hits 4 times, it's never going to show up as one big number on the health bar. It will be counted individually for each hit, and thus only one small portion of your overall damage is going to be accounted for in the 1.5 multiplier. I don't have the exact numbers for this fight, so I'll give you an example. Say you're power stancing, like I am now. Let's say your left-hand weapon does 400 damage and your right hand 500 damage. Of course, that means your total amount of damage in one hit is 900. So a crit would simply multiply that by 1.5 to give you 1350, right? Well, not exactly. You've probably noticed that when I hit something in power stance, you see 2 numbers flash across the health bar. And that's because the game calculates both hits separately. So in our example, we would see 500 and 400 appear one after the other. However, there are some cases where it gets counted as a single number if both weapons hit the enemy at the same time, which seems to depend on your position. Based on that, if you can figure out a way for the number to consistently show up as the full total of 900, you can get the full crit for 1350. At least, that's what I initially thought. So I put myself through hours of this stupid fight, because even though I had already gotten a few crits and they were never enough for a one-shot, it was always the same number getting multiplied. Let's say it was the 500 value. So I was convinced that it was something wrong with my positioning, and I was just getting bad luck by getting 2 parts of damage counted instead of 1. Eventually, I got a crit with the other value, and at this point, I couldn't take it anymore, and had to accept that no matter what, the game will always roll the left and right weapons separately for the gauntlet crit, regardless of how it appears on the health bar. But I wasn't ready to give up on that one shot just yet. I still have one more glimmer of hope. You see, while I ruled out the Grand Lance's jumping attack on Najka, I hadn't even tried it on the Covetous Demon, and just because it didn't work on Najka, there was no reason to assume that would be the case here. The Covetous Demon marks a turning point, where this turned from a challenge run to a casino simulator, which I guess makes the character I chose for this even more fitting now that I think about it. After I had gambled away even more hours of my life for the 5% chance crit, it finally happened, and the Covetous Demon was defeated in one hit. Once I went through Earthen Peak, I brought Gilligan along with me back to Majula and asked him to sit by this pit so I could have a more convenient location to dump his body. And once that little errand was done, we could proceed towards Mytha. I got a silver-black spear from one of the enemies here and decided to use it. It has some innate dark damage, so infusing it with dark on top of the buff from Resonant Weapon should make for some ridiculous damage. I mean, yeah, that damage is pretty ridiculous if we're talking about normal gameplay, but for us, that's not gonna cut it. I ultimately switched back to the Grand Lance for the higher physical damage, since she is also weak to thrust, like a lot of other things have been. As you can see, the heavy attack is like, what, maybe 20 or 30 damage shy of a one-shot? I heard the crit sound, so maybe if a different hit got the multiplier, it would be enough. Or we could just hit her with Whisper of Despair. That debuff will add up with all those hits. But sadly, it looks like this will be another Lost Sinner situation where she's not gonna let us cast Whisper of Despair. Well, back to the casino it is. You know what? While the Bright Bug's still going, maybe I should style on this Mimic too. Okay, well I see the item, so I definitely got the kill, so that still counts. I just don't get the item, I guess. Let that be a lesson to not die before picking up one-time drops. After toiling away in Earthen Peak for so long, it's nice to blow off some steam and take care of a few more of those lesser targets on the hit list. While I'm out this way, I'll free Ornifex and spare her life. For now. Fingarl's body is a really easy kill if you forget about the power stancing shenanigans and backstab him. It's a little embarrassing that it took a few failed kills for me to realize that. But anyways, moving on, we have one more mini-boss to take out, then it's back to the grind with the main bosses. I'm gonna try out the Rotten first, since this is another boss with a big weakness to thrust damage. Weighing in at slightly over 7,000 HP, this thing is one of the tankiest targets we'll encounter in the run that's still within the bounds of a two-shot. The good news is, it's so slow that we can almost always run across the room and have time for the Trident buff to maximize our damage output. The bad news is, the Rotten is resistant to dark damage, which is typically the strongest buff overall, since Resonant Weapon is the strongest weapon buff. Plus, we don't have any of the other clutch rings, so it's hard for our other elements to compete with it. Right now, our best bet is to use lightning against it, since that's its weakness, though ironically, we would need to beat the Rotten to get the lightning clutch ring to boost our damage further. The only other thing we could possibly get to boost it is Sunlight Blade, but if I go to the Shrine of Amana now, I'll miss out on some of Malentia's Brightbud stock, so that's not happening. But now that we know we can do that much damage to the tankiest of the great ones, at least we're practically guaranteed to be able to two-shot the remaining two. So let's focus on what we can do before jumping the gun with the Rotten. I've been exclusively using melee for the entirety of the playthrough, so maybe it's finally time I test out spells for a change. Just as we were allowed to back up our save to conserve bright bugs, we were also allowed to back up our save to farm non-respawning enemies for rare drops. So after a bit of farming, I finally got the Black Witch Domino Mask. This will give about a 3% boost to all types of spells. Not anything crazy, but still better than no boost at all. On the topic of magic, I might as well max out my attunement so I don't run into any problems with spell slots. Now, to get a spell, first I'm going to try out miracles, so we'll need some sunlight metals to get Sunlight Spear. I use the typical method of exploiting this lone falconer until I get one to drop. Thank God for Cheat Engine. I've never even used Cheat Engine before this run, but now that I've gotten a taste, I'm worried I'll get withdrawal symptoms in my future runs. I know I was leading up to using miracles against something, but I kinda got off track again and started attempting the Old Iron King. This is another boss with very generous buff windows, provided you don't get unlucky with the laser attack. I can already tell that this is gonna be another casino fight, so you know what, we'll try something else. Again. Even though I was making a big deal about the Pursuer and unlocking infusions, I've been neglecting them during the run, which has been making my damage suffer as a result. Since I don't have a spell buff for fire damage, I have no choice but to infuse my left-hand weapon with fire and hope for the best against the Duke's Dear Freya. She is only slightly weak against strike damage and resistant to every other type of damage besides fire, which is a bit of a problem for me since my fire damage leaves a lot to be desired. What's also a bit more of a problem is the fact that there's no time to buff in this fight with all the little spiders chasing you around at all times. Okay, I've had enough. Wasn't I gonna try spells next? Hey, that sounds like a nice change of pace. First, we need to get a better chime. And we can also get the disc chime to hold in our offhand for another 3% boost to miracle damage. With all these buffs, I can feel the power of Gwen surging through my body. Now the Rotten will feel the bolt gun of the gods themselves. Power of the gods sure ain't what it used to be, but sometimes you gotta count your blessings. For instance, in the original version of the game, I wouldn't be able to ward off the spiders with the torch. Using the projectile from the ice rapier made picking off the spiders much easier, and once I was sure they were all gone, I would have enough time to buff and fight Freya before another wave spawned in. I'm sure there's a way to one-shot her. I suspect that if I had done Dark Lurker first to get Climax and then got Kaitha's Chime, I would have been able to do it with sufficient buffs combined with a crit from the gauntlets. The only reason I hadn't done Dark Lurker yet was because I was worried I would miss out on rewards by killing Grandal, but we'll talk more about that when we get there. For now, I decided to settle on a 2-shot because I was sick of having to kill the spiders after every single failure. The Duke himself is a target, and he's basically 2 free points. We could also try Smelter Demon for a chance to get the Ring of Blades +1. None of the generic pursuers are targets, so we can think of it as a nice little bonus for defeating the Smelter Demon. I honestly don't think this is happening with the damage I'm doing now, especially considering that I don't have time for Whisper of Despair. In that case, it might be better to infuse my left-hand hammer with Dark on top of applying Resonant Weapon. After going through the usual buff routine, this was enough to 2-shot the Old Iron King with one hit triggering the gauntlets. This could potentially be a turning point in the playthrough, with all the things we get in the Broom Tower DLC. For one thing, we can farm for the Smelter Hammer, which has the highest physical AR of any weapon accessible to us. I already got one to drop from natural progression when I wasn't recording, but if I need any more, I could always spawn them in since they can be farmed from the enemies that wield them. We can finally get another clutch ring to add to our collection, quickly escape from the scene of the crime. Then, do a little more farming until we get the blue dagger. This is like the Crisp Blade from Demon Souls. It boosts magic damage while lowering magic defense. The boost is slightly higher than the Disc Chime and works for all types of magic rather than just miracles, so it's a full upgrade. We can't forget to get those precious bright bugs either. I don't know how many I'll need, but it's always good to make sure they never run low. After some more calculations and hours upon hours of attempts, I finally had a breakthrough with the Rotten. I realized that a single crit on the Lance's jumping attack with full stamina, combined with a regular heavy attack, would be enough for a 2-shot. Even though I tried this combination early on, it turns out I did less damage because I went into the negative with stamina. Additionally, both hits have to be counter hits, which typically isn't an issue on slow bosses. Once I confirmed that the first hit was a crit, I had to patiently wait for it to attack again, then go in decisively for the counter with the heavy. At long last, all of the Great Ones are defeated, and I can proceed towards the castle without worries. After splurging on some endurance, I can now go to the Sunken City to retrieve Flynn's Ring and the Lightning Clutch Ring. Another important thing I got from here was the Sanctum Shield, but I didn't register its value at the time and thus wasn't recording when I picked it up. It's an omni-casting tool like the Black Witch's Staff, which is super important because it means I don't have to switch between multiple casting tools and scramble to apply buffs. You'll see a good example on one boss in particular. For now, we're gonna give the twin Dragon Riders a go, first without using a Bright Bug, just in case we can one-shot them without it. You also may have noticed that I swapped my left-hand weapon to the Dragon Tooth. It took me an embarrassing amount of time to learn this, but not all weapon infusions are equal. The Dragon Tooth is an exception among Great Hammers that gets a really big boost when infused, that results in higher AR than I would get from the Demon's Great Hammer, or even another infused Smelter Hammer. I've got an awkward setup with a combination of the Lightning Infusion and Dark Buff, but if I had chosen one or the other, the damage wouldn't have been enough to impact the result of the fight. A few rounds of testing showed that I would indeed have to use a Bright Bug against these losers if I wanted to one-shot them both. I was able to find a pretty consistent method to cast Whisperer's Despair and buff my weapon before getting attacked. Now it was just a matter of getting lucky with the gauntlets. Thankfully, the archer is very weak, like regular enemy level weak, so our entrance to the King's Passage is already secured. Oh, and before I forget, there's another mimic here as well. The next boss, the Looking Glass Knight, is very resistant to lightning. So much so that the rain in the arena isn't really going to cancel it out. So it's best that we swap the lightning infusion on the Dragon Tooth for a dark one. Buffing in itself isn't a problem in this fight. Not to mention, if I spam the cast button on Whisper of Despair, I can get the jump attack to happen every time. The problem is, I barely have enough time for 2 hits before the Trident buff wears off. And of course, I can't exactly be precise when aiming 2 oversized turkey legs, so most of the time one of those hits gets blocked. I took a look at the numbers again and realized that I wasn't doing enough damage anyway, so my only choice now is to attempt Smelter Demon again. Remember how I said there was one boss in particular that was a perfect example of the Sanctum Shield's utility? Well, here it is. Unlike before, I can debuff him with Whisper of Despair since I only need 1 catalyst for everything. So I only have to swap once, which is when I buff my other weapon with Pine Resin. After I hit him once, the rest of the fight is pretty scripted. From here, I'll cast Whisper of Despair one more time during his first buff to make sure it doesn't wear off. Once he starts the second buff, that's my cue to start dancing. After this, I simply rebuff my right hand weapon and hope the gauntlets go off on the second hit. And there we go! That's the Smelter Demon out of the way, and a Ring of Blades +1 for our troubles. That should be just enough extra damage to get the Looking Glass Knight, but we'll still need a crit from the gauntlets, of course. This time I managed to actually get a proper hit without the Mirror Shield getting in the way, and I was gonna go straight for the second one, but noticed that my Trident buff had already worn off. So I decided to see if I could run to the other side of the arena to rebuff before he catches back up to me. I gotta say, this fight was a lot easier than I expected it to be. Sure, it took a bit of planning before I could get my damage to be where it needed to be, but that's what the run's all about, playing around until you find something that works. After defeating the Looking Glass Knight, we can buy the final batch of Bright Bugs off of Melintia. I only need one thing from the Shrine of Amana, that thing being Sunlight Blade. So once I get that, I go back to the first bonfire to reallocate my stats and finally test out Flynn's Ring. To get the maximum AR boost of 50 points, you need to have an equip load under 60, so all I have to do is lower my vitality down to 14 points. I want to see if Flynn's Ring will make the damage on the lance even crazier. That was short-lived. After reallocating my points back to where I was before, I figured Demon of Song would have to be a 2-shot as well, so once again, the same buff routine as always, then we wait for it to hop on over here and try our luck with the gauntlets again. By the way, this guy is weak to dark, so I bet Climax would have been a 1-shot here as well, but what's done is done, and I'm satisfied with my victory regardless. Wasting no time, I head straight to Velstadt to test out our new weapon buff. Getting in our first hit is easy enough, but the second one is where the issues start. I was still naive on my first attempt and let him proceed with his buff. After all, I needed to rebuff too, so it was only fair. His will wear off in a second, I'm sure. Well, it doesn't wear off. His defenses stay buffed for the rest of the fight. With this knowledge, I quickly figured out what I would need to do. I need to hit him twice immediately in that split-second window before he starts his buff. This didn't seem too complicated. I was used to having to finish things quickly anyway due to how short the Trident buff lasts. The most logical way to achieve this was to get him to do an attack with a bigger recovery window so he can't Q the buff. I was prepared to be at this for hours, but to my surprise, this fight barely took any time at all and was, also to my surprise, one of the easiest bosses in the run. Okay then, I suppose we can move on to Aldia's Keep right away. We've got 6 mimics to take out here, so I'll be counting those as I go. Even though it's nothing like it was before the nerfs, Soul Geyser could still be useful, so I'll pick it up just to have it as an option. Then we have this big ol' room of mimics to clear out, 3 to be exact. And we can't forget about these creepy crawlies that escaped confinement. I say that, but I did in fact forget about one of them and had to come back for it later. Before that, I killed the mimic in the camp to get the Staff of Wisdom. And since that quest is coming up soon, why not go ahead and take out the Emerald Herald too? Don't worry, little guy, I didn't forget you. Guardian Dragon will be a piece of cake. We have plenty of time to finish buffing before it has time to... Well, surely the fire won't get us if we make sure to get close enough first. I guess I'll have to get under its head to bait the fire then? Dark Lurker it is. Pfft, this guy's such an amateur. Unleash Magic can't be stacked with Bright Bugs, but it buffs for the exact same amount, so it's a perfect replacement to save Bright Bugs on fights where we don't use melee. Dark Lurker is very resistant against physical damage, so spells are our only choice. At least we have time to finish with all our buffing before we go in. I can't even make a "where did my buffs go" joke, because at first I didn't even notice that my buffs were gone. Yeah, it took me a minute to notice that the bright and obvious blue aura around my character wasn't there. Well, it hardly matters because the devs were nice enough to give us a built-in buff window during the laser attack. It just so happens to be the exact amount of time as it takes to finish a Trident dance. I don't know how I didn't think of this before, but Heavenly Thunder exists, and it is capable of absurd damage under the right circumstances. It's very RNG based, especially on smaller targets. But if you can get all 4 bolts to land, that's already more than half of the Dark Lurker's health deleted. That's not even taking into account the possibility of 1 or more of the bolts getting a crit from the gauntlets. Up to this point, I had never gotten so lucky with Heavenly Thunder, so I tried my luck with Sunlight Spear, hoping it would crit, preferring to take my chances there, rather than with another cast of Heavenly Thunder. Since that didn't work, I guess I'm going back to the Guardian Dragon. This time, I'm making Sacred Oath. I deliberated over making this or the Sacred Chime Hammer. I decided this would be more helpful in the long run, since many of the late game targets are highly resistant to dark damage. The buff routine is mostly the same with this. The only thing to remember is that Sacred Oath must be cast before using a Bright Bug, since Bright Bugs stack with Sacred Oath, but not vice versa. I did get a crit on the Guardian Dragon, looked at the damage, and thought about whether or not I should try again and go for a one-shot, but in that split second, I decided I just wanted to carry on and get the Torso Stone, so I settled on a 2-shot. This is the first and last time we'll be seeing Ancient Dragon. Almost 20,000 health? Yeah, no way I'm putting myself through that. We're just gonna get this invader out of the way, pick up the egg, and get Crystal Magic Weapon, then we're out of here. Now I will show the proof that I have unlocked a dragon scale form so I can spawn in enough to get the dragon torso stone. I've seen a couple of different numbers going around, but I'm pretty sure the damage buff for this is 15%. If not, feel free to correct me. I honestly don't know what to believe about buffs in this game anymore. Regardless of the exact amount, the boost it does give should be enough to take out some of the tankier NPCs I've left lying around. The roar doesn't do any damage, it only staggers, like the Force Miracle. So it still counts as a one-shot even if the NPCs get caught in the shockwave. Despite my extra power, there were a few NPCs who were still too stubborn to die, namely Navlan and Captain Drummond. I still have one more trick up my sleeve. I haven't even picked up the Giant Warrior Club, aka the weapon with the highest physical damage in the whole game. Not only does it have the highest physical AR when uninfused, when infused, it gets a higher elemental bonus than even the Dragon Tooth, falling just a little behind the Dark Sacred Chime Hammer in overall AR. It's still not enough to take out either of the two without using the gauntlets, which I did for Navlan, but was too burnt out to try for again for Drummond. But now I should also be trying to defeat the Throne Duo, but even if a crit were enough for one, the odds of getting 2 crits to one-shot both of them are too low to even consider. It would be cool if I could hit them both at the same time for full damage each, but as cool as that would be, it doesn't seem like that will work with this setup. So, what now? I was asking myself this as I was starting to run out of options for things to 1- and 2-shot. I really needed to defeat the Dark Lurker to get Climax, but without the Dragon Chime, my chances of beating the Dark Lurker were even lower, and the only way to get it is by defeating the Dark Lurker or by killing Grandal. But if I kill him, he won't give me Climax, right? At that moment, I realized that I'm not even sure that's the case, so you know what? Why don't I test it? I made another save to kill Grandal, waited 3 hours for his grave to appear, rejoined the Covenant, killed Dark Lurker, and it turns out, you can get Climax after all. If I had tested this out earlier in the run, I could have gotten a lot more points. Guardian Dragon versus Climax is just that coughing baby meme. I mean, I guess I wouldn't have the Torso Stone either, but even with the Priest Chime, this was theoretically possible. The RNG aspect is just amplified the lower your damage is. I rewatched the clip where I hit 4 bolts over and over, trying to analyze my positioning, the Dark Lurker's positioning, and anything else that could help me pull that off consistently. What I found to be pretty consistent that I learned from that clip is casting near a wall. Whenever I casted near a wall, it would force the bolts into a smaller area since they have nowhere else to land, which made it more likely for them to hit their target. This is just what seemed to be the case. I still had a few casts near the wall miss him completely, so take this with a grain of salt. I had to cut out the 4 minutes of me waiting around for another buff window before I finally hit him with the first cast of Heavenly Thunder. And there it was. The good luck I had been waiting for. 3 bolts hit him. I had to finish this now. I couldn't afford to waste this opportunity. My heart was racing, but to secure the victory, I had to be calm and wait for the telltale purple mist before his mitosis. If I land Sunlight Spear at the right time, I'll be able to hit them both and double my damage output. This has got to be one of the most satisfying kills of the run, even if it was a 2-shot. Now, just as I did before, I wait for Grandal's grave to appear so I can claim my much-deserved reward. Giant Lord should be very easy to one-shot with Climax, so I was really confused that I was doing so little damage to him. In another weird twist, I had accidentally equipped the wrong chime for the fight and didn't even notice until much later. That's how you know all that gambling has fried my brain. In the meantime, we can at least one-shot both members of the Throne Duo, but of course that also took a few hours because the gauntlets hate me. The Throne Watcher has much less health, so I don't need the gauntlets for her. I just have to be sure the Torso Stone is active. Since the 1 point of health they are left with is a scripted mechanic, this still counts as a one-shot because clearly the damage done with Climax is more than enough for both of them. After this, I think I'm ready for another break, so let's have a little fun with some of those optional early game bosses, shall we? Well, the Royal Rat Authority needed a crit, so that wasn't fun, but it makes the sight of its sickening face turning to dust that much more rewarding. Next on the list we have Vingarl's Head, Millabeth, and all the Firekeepers. After this, I moved on to the only DLC boss that seemed doable at the moment, which was the Gank Squad. Sadly, Climax is out of the question, because if I can't kill Sarah, the weakest of the group, then I can't kill the others. Melee, on the other hand, seems much more viable, and after taking care of the archer, I can use the secret safe spot to reapply my buffs. Well, that's not how I planned this to go down. Come on down here and fight me, you cowards! Stop blocking so we can have an epic showdown of turkey legs. Oh, so now that your buddy's here you want to attack. Typical PvEers, am I right? I highly doubt this is possible without poison, which I've been avoiding in this run, but I'm gonna give Ava a go to get a feel for her defenses. That's honestly a lot better than I was expecting, but unfortunately, that's about it for Ava in my run. I'm sure some others will have beaten her, and I can't wait to see it. As for me, well, I just realized at this point in my run that I was using the wrong chime against Giant Lord, and I'm happy to say that with Kaitha's chime, he goes down in one hit with a gauntlet crit. Once I was this late in the run, my progress as far as bosses were concerned started to slow down. I know it's supposed to be show, don't tell, but my hard drive said otherwise, so I'm gonna have to show some semi-related clips while I discuss my Nashandra attempts. I had to delete most of my attempts because I was about to run out of space, so I'll give you a summary of what happened. I didn't beat Nashandra. I had more attempts on this fight than anything else in the whole run. I was trying this up to the very last day of the challenge's deadline. Though I was trying to do this run without using poison, this was a boss that would have been impossible without poison, unless I could get some insane luck with Heavenly Thunder crits. I only tried the Sanctum Mace and didn't apply any other poison spells. I figured it would be too tedious to swap back and forth between a Pyromancy Flame and all my other buffs. I guess I just completely forgot about Dark Fog. Even with her high resistance to poison, that surely would have done the trick and would only need a single catalyst. I just would have needed to poison her for both hits. Instead, I just kept throwing Heavenly Thunder at her, hoping for the mythical 2 crits I would need to beat her. Unfortunately, even if I had been lucky enough to get 2 of the bolts to crit, that would have still left her with a sliver of health. However, if I could get 2 bolts of the initial cast to crit, I could use the Dragon Torso Stone, rebuff, and hit her again with all 4 bolts and finish her that way, but like I said, I never even managed to get 2 crits out of hundreds of attempts. At this point, it was time for me to accept defeat on Nashandra. The challenge deadline was rapidly approaching, so I needed to tie up a few loose ends before concluding my run. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but Cromwell can still absolve your sins even when he's dead, so once we've washed the blood off of our hands, we'll have full damage on the Lost Sinner's sword. Since I was basically finished with bosses at this point, I decided to use a Bright Bug on the Executioner's Chariot. And it's not like I would have run out, even if I did somehow defeat a few more bosses. Now that I've maxed out my HP, I can trade with the Chariot in RTSR range without dying, which means I can finally get that one-shot. And don't worry, we all confirmed with Lemon that the scripted ledge kill in this fight won't count as a hit as long as the damage we did beforehand was undoubtedly more than its total HP. No matter what you do, this boss will always be left with 1 HP if you don't use the gate. and it's pretty clear that the damage I was doing was more than the boss's amount of HP. I tried to be clever and use a broken ladle since it doesn't do any damage, but this fight is pretty strict in the sense that you have to actually do damage to it in order for it to fall, even though it doesn't actually take damage until it hits the floor. When the boss is taken care of, we can also take out the NPC locked behind it. I've been putting off the Milfinitos for a while because I wasn't sure what order to do it in without screwing up and locking myself out of one of the kills. Several sources online said that the injured Milfinito can be respawned with a bonfire ascetic, since she counts more as an enemy than an NPC, so I decided to test this out. The devs must have known some people would reflexively attack her, but even then, that's surprisingly forgiving. Now that we've one-shot her, let's use our ascetic, and there you have it. Now we can interact with her again, and cheat the system to get the last Milfinito behind the locked door. I think this is the only game where NPCs ragdoll instead of using the standard player death animation. It adds some extra goofiness to the kills. After tracking down all the Milfinitos in my area, I got around to something that I could have done at the beginning of the playthrough, knocking Lycia off a cliff. For the longest time I wanted to be unique and kill her with a crit, but for some reason the gauntlets refused to go off after 3 hours, so I lost my patience and did things the old-fashioned way. Agdane absolutely refused to follow me out of this room, so I didn't have much of a choice in this case, but thankfully, the RNG was much kinder to me here. As the run comes to a close, I did actually beat just one more boss, the Gank Squad. At first, I was trying all kinds of complicated stuff, like luring them into the water to lower their lightning defense, and using counter damage to get them one at a time, then rebuffing and repeating, and so on. But then I realized there was also the obvious strategy, one that has proven to be indomitable against many an overly aggressive Gank Squad. We'll just take them to Backstab City. Well, I think that about wraps up my entry in the Dark Souls 2 two-shot contest. Thank you everyone for being here to watch my suffering, as well as all the other runners suffering, and thank you Lemon for reaching out to me and inviting me to the contest. I gotta say it was certainly a surprise, but a very welcome one since I am always up to doing anything related to Dark Souls 2. So, now that this challenge is complete, it's time to relax after so many tears and so much tedium induced by this game by playing it again. I hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for the next one.